Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The November fog of 1889 hung over Baker Street like a yellow shroud, muffling the familiar sounds of London's evening bustle into a distant, dreamlike murmur. I had returned from my afternoon rounds to find Sherlock Holmes sprawled in his armchair, his long frame draped in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, staring with apparent fascination at the dancing flames in our hearth. The air was thick with the smoke of his black shag tobacco, and I could see, by the restless drumming of his fingers upon the chair arm, that his mind was chafing against the absence of any stimulating problem. "You are debating," said he suddenly, without shifting his gaze from the fire, "whether to file those case notes you carry, or whether the Whitmore affair was too trivial to warrant preservation for posterity." I confess that even after years of partnership with Holmes, such demonstrations never failed to startle me. I had indeed been turning over in my mind the question of my notes from the previous week's rather mundane case of industrial espionage. "My dear Holmes," I began, but he waved a dismissive hand. "The slight bulge in your left coat pocket, the manner in which you favoured that side while removing your coat, and the small ink stain on your right cuff all tell the tale clearly enough. You have been writing, Watson, and writing about something that troubles your sense of literary proportion. The Whitmore case, while profitable, lacked the dramatic elements that make your chronicles so popular with the reading public." Before I could respond to this typically precise analysis, the sharp jangle of our bell echoed through the flat, followed by Mrs. Hudson's measured tread upon the stairs. She appeared a moment later with a card upon her silver tray, her expression suggesting that our visitor was in some considerable state of agitation. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," said she. "He appears most distressed and says the matter cannot wait until morning." Holmes glanced at the card and his eyes brightened with the first spark of interest I had seen in days. "Mr. Edmund Carstairs, master builder and architect," he read aloud. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson Watson, pray remain. I suspect this may prove worthy of your notebook after all." The man who entered our sitting-room was perhaps 40 years of age, broad-shouldered and weathered by years of outdoor work. His clothes, though well-made, were dusty with what appeared to be brick dust and mortar, and his hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat. Most striking of all was the expression of barely controlled terror that haunted his features. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice hoarse with strain, "I have come to you because what I have witnessed defies all natural law, and I fear that Scotland Yard would think me mad." Holmes gestured to the chair beside the fire and leaned forward with that predatory intensity I knew so well. "Pray be seated, Mr. Carstairs. I observe that you have spent the day working in the basement levels of an old building, one with particularly thick masonry walls, and that something you encountered there has shaken you considerably. The clay on your boots suggests proximity to the Thames, and the particular shade of dust on your coat indicates stonework of considerable age." Carstairs stared at Holmes in amazement before sinking into the offered chair. "You are correct in every particular, sir. I have been overseeing the restoration of Raven's Hollow House, a Tudor mansion that has stood empty for 30 years. We have been working to shore up the foundation walls in the lowest cellar, walls that are 4 feet thick and built directly against the solid earth of the riverbank." He paused, drawing a shaking breath before continuing. "This afternoon, while my men were away at their midday meal, I heard something that should have been impossible. From within those solid walls, Mr. Holmes, came the sound of knocking, not the settling of old timbers or the scurrying of rats, but the deliberate, measured knocking of human knuckles against stone." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "You investigated, naturally?" I pressed my ear to the wall and knocked 3 times with my hammer, Mr. Holmes, I swear to you on my mother's grave, 3 knocks came back from the other side. From within walls that back directly onto tons of packed earth, where no living creature could possibly exist. The room fell silent save for the crackling of the fire. Holmes rose and walked to the window, gazing out into the fog-shrouded street below. When he turned back to face our visitor, his expression was grave but animated with the thrill of a truly perplexing puzzle. "Mr. Carstairs," said he, "you have brought me a problem worthy of investigation. Watson and I shall accompany you to Raven's Hollow House tomorrow morning. Tonight, however, I must ask you to recount every detail of this afternoon's events, omitting nothing, however trivial it may seem. In cases such as these, it is often the smallest thread that, when pulled, unravels the entire mystery." For several moments, Carstairs sat in silence, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the brandy glass. The firelight played across his weathered features, and I could see that the mere recollection of his experience brought back the terror he had felt in those subterranean depths. Holmes, observing the man's distress with characteristic precision, leaned forward in his chair and spoke in the gentle but insistent tone he reserved for extracting crucial details from shaken witnesses. "Come now, Mr. Carstairs, you are a man of practical experience, accustomed to the sounds and movements of old buildings. Begin at the beginning and omit nothing, however trivial it may appear." The builder drew a steadying breath and fixed his gaze upon the dancing flames. It was precisely 10 minutes past 1 o'clock when I first heard the sound. I had remained in the cellar after sending my men to their midday meal, as is my custom when examining work of particular importance. The cellar in question, what we call the undercroft, lies beneath the oldest section of the house, where the Tudor foundations meet the Georgian extension added some century and a half later. Holmes nodded approvingly. "You were entirely alone in this cellar?" "Completely alone, sir. There is but one stairway leading down, and I should have heard the approach of any person. The silence in those depths is absolute. No sound from the street above penetrates that thickness of stone and earth. I was examining a slight bulge that has appeared in the southern foundation wall, running my level along the course of ancient bricks, when I heard it clearly, 3 deliberate knocks, as distinct as if someone had rapped upon my own front door." "And you recognized immediately that this was no natural sound of settling timber or scurrying vermin?" Carstairs shook his head emphatically. "Mr. Holmes, I have spent 20 years among crumbling masonry. I know the groan of shifting beams, the scratch of rats in the walls, the drip of hidden water finding its way through mortar joints. This was none of those familiar sounds. It was purposeful, measured, as though some conscious intelligence sought to attract my attention from within that solid wall." Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing, his long stride carrying him from hearth to window and back again. "You responded to this summons?" "I did, sir, though I confess my hand shook as I raised my hammer. I struck the wall 3 times, matching the rhythm I had heard. For perhaps 10 seconds there was silence, and I began to hope I had imagined the entire incident. Then, as clearly as I hear your voice now, 3 answering knocks came from within the masonry, slightly muffled but unmistakably deliberate. "Most extraordinary," I could not help interjecting. "You attempted further communication?" "Twice more, Dr. Watson. Each time I knocked, the response came back, sometimes after a brief delay, sometimes immediately, but always matching my pattern exactly. When I called out asking who was there, there was no voice in reply, only those same measured knocks, as if some mute prisoner were trapped within the very stones." Holmes paused in his pacing, his hawk-like profile silhouetted against the window. "Tell me about the house itself, Mr. Carstairs." Who is the present owner, and what do you know of its history? The current proprietor is Mr. Aldous Pemberton of Pemberton and Associates, the shipping concern. He inherited Ravens Hollow House some 6 months past from a distant cousin and has engaged my firm to make the property habitable once more. As for its history, Carstairs hesitated, then continued with obvious reluctance. I am a builder, not a collector of gossip, but one cannot work in such a place without hearing the local tales. The house has stood empty for 30 years, since the death of its last permanent resident, Sir Bertram Ravens Hollow. Ah, said Holmes, his eyes brightening with interest. And what manner of man was this Sir Bertram? By all accounts, a gentleman of violent temper and peculiar habits. There was some scandal, the exact nature of which seems lost to time, that resulted in the dismissal of the entire household staff in a single day. Sir Bertram himself died not long after, under what the local records describe as melancholy circumstances. The house passed to a cousin who never occupied it, and it has remained shuttered and abandoned ever since. Holmes returned to his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. You mentioned that you demonstrated this phenomenon to Mr. Pemberton. What was his reaction? That is perhaps the strangest part of the entire affair, Mr. Holmes. When I sent word of what I had experienced, Mr. Pemberton arrived within the hour. I led him to the cellar and repeated my experiment with the knocking. When the answering sounds came from within the wall, I expected him to share my alarm. Instead, he seemed almost expectant, as though he had anticipated such an occurrence. Indeed, his exact words, if you please. Carstairs furrowed his brow in concentration. He said, "So the old stories were true after all. I had hoped they were merely family legends." When I pressed him for explanation, he became evasive and would say only that there were tales connected with Ravens Hollow House that he had dismissed as superstition. He instructed me to cease all work in the Undercroft immediately and to speak of the matter to no one. Then he gave me your address, Mr. Holmes, saying that if any man in London could solve such a puzzle, it would be you. Mr. Pemberton knew of my methods then? He spoke of you with considerable respect, sir, and seemed confident that you would take an interest in the case. He has agreed to meet us at the house tomorrow morning, and has promised to share whatever family history might bear upon the mystery. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed in thought. One final question, Mr. Carstairs. You mentioned a bulge in the southern foundation wall. Have you noticed any other architectural peculiarities in your work there? Now that you mention it, yes. Yesterday, my foreman remarked that one of the interior partition walls in the south wing sounds hollow when struck, though our architectural drawings show it to be solid masonry throughout. I had planned to investigate the matter more thoroughly, but today's events have rather driven it from my mind. Holmes opened his eyes fully and shot me a meaningful glance. A wall that should be solid, but sounds hollow, and another that produces answering knocks from within solid stone. You perceive the connection, Watson? I perceive that you suspect some form of architectural deception, I replied cautiously. A suspicion only at present, said Holmes, rising to escort our visitor to the door. We must not outrun the evidence. Mr. Carstairs, you will meet us at Ravens Hollow House at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Bring strong lanterns and whatever tools might be necessary to examine that partition wall more closely. Watson, pray ensure that your service revolver is in good order. Empty houses by the Thames sometimes harbour dangers more tangible than restless spirits. After Carstairs had departed into the fog-shrouded night, I turned to find Holmes standing motionless before the fire, his lean profile etched against the dancing flames. The restless energy that had animated him during our visitor's extraordinary account had given way to that peculiar stillness which I had learned to recognize as the precursor to his most intense intellectual activity. His long fingers were steepled beneath his chin, and his grey eyes held that distant, calculating expression that signaled the rapid sorting and cataloguing of facts within that remarkable mind. "You are wondering," said he at length, without shifting his gaze from the hearth, "whether I give any credence to the supernatural explanation that our practical Mr. Carstairs so carefully avoided voicing aloud." The thought had indeed occurred to me, I admitted, settling into my chair with my neglected medical journals, "though I know your views on such matters well enough." Holmes turned from the fire and began his characteristic pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. "When you have eliminated the impossible, Watson, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. That principle has guided me through many seemingly inexplicable cases, and I see no reason to abandon it now. Ghosts do not knock from within walls in measured response to human communication. Living men, however, might do so under certain circumstances, and architectural deceptions might produce sounds that the imaginative mind interprets as spectral manifestation. You suspect some form of concealed chamber, then?" "I suspect nothing as yet, though I observe several suggestive features in Mr. Carstairs' account. Consider, if you will, the curious behaviour of Mr. Pemberton. A shipping merchant discovers an apparently impossible phenomenon in a recently inherited property, and rather than dismissing it as fancy or seeking explanation through conventional means, he immediately provides the name of a consulting detective. This suggests either prior knowledge or at least prior suspicion of something irregular about Raven's Hollow House." He paused before his bookshelf and began extracting various volumes with practiced efficiency. Furthermore, Pemberton's reaction to the knocking was not one of surprise but of confirmation. "So the old stories were true after all," he said. "What stories, Watson? What family legends could encompass the notion of sounds emanating from within solid masonry? Before we visit that accursed house tomorrow, I intend to learn everything available about its history and former occupants." For the next several hours, Holmes immersed himself in research with that extraordinary concentration which never failed to amaze me. He consulted property records, genealogical charts, and back numbers of the Times, occasionally making notes in his commonplace book or cross-referencing one source against another. I attempted to read, but found my thoughts returning persistently to that dark cellar and the image of some unknown hand striking stone from within an impossible prison. It was past midnight when Holmes finally set aside his books and turned to me with an expression of grim satisfaction. "I have discovered several items of considerable interest, Watson. Sir Bertram Ravenshollow was indeed a figure of some notoriety in his day. He was a collector of antiquities with a particular fascination for medieval architecture and construction techniques. In 1858 he published a scholarly monograph on the subject of priest holes and hidden chambers in Tudor houses, demonstrating remarkable expertise in the methods by which such spaces were concealed from detection." "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. "Then you believe the house contains a secret chamber?" "I believe it highly probable. What is more intriguing, however, is this." He held up a yellowed newspaper clipping. "In February of 1859, Sir Bertram's younger brother, Captain James Ravenshollow, disappeared without trace while visiting the family estate. An extensive search was conducted, but no sign of the captain was ever discovered. The official conclusion was that he had met with an accident while walking near the river, and that his body had been swept away by the current. But you suspect otherwise. I suspect, Watson, that tomorrow's investigation may reveal truths that have lain hidden for more than 30 years. Now, I suggest we both retire. We shall need clear heads and steady nerves for whatever awaits us in the depths of Raven's Hollow House." The November morning brought no respite from the fog, which hung over London like a yellow pall, muffling the familiar sounds of the awakening city. We set forth at the appointed hour, finding a hansom without difficulty, despite the thick mist. The journey took us eastward along the Thames through increasingly grim neighbourhoods where the great houses backed onto the river in crumbling grandeur. "You know this district?" I inquired as Holmes directed our driver down a narrow side street I would have missed entirely. "In outline only," he replied, drawing his cloak closer against the penetrating chill. "I have studied property records in connection with another matter. Raven's Hollow House occupies a singular position, hemmed in on three sides by more modern structures, yet its river frontage remains almost untouched. Such isolation is often conducive to both secrecy and mischief. Our destination proved to be a brooding edifice of dark brick and blackened timber, its Tudor origins evident in the heavy beams and overhanging upper stories that seemed to scowl down at the neglected street. The house stood isolated behind rusted iron gates, separated from its neighbours by a walled garden where rank weeds choked the remains of what had once been ornamental shrubbery. The damp chill of the nearby Thames seemed to have seeped into the very bones of the structure, giving it an air of profound melancholy that no amount of daylight could dispel. Two figures awaited us by the heavy oak door, the familiar, anxious form of Edmund Carstairs and a taller, more gaunt man whom I took to be the owner. Aldous Pemberton was a person of nervous disposition, constantly adjusting his well-tailored coat and casting uneasy glances toward the darkened windows of his own property. His dress was fashionable but somehow incongruous against the backdrop of decay, and when he stepped forward to greet us, I detected in his manner an eagerness that bordered on desperation. "Mr. Holmes," said he, extending a slightly trembling hand, "I am grateful that you have not delayed. This house has waited long for an accounting, and I confess I would see it concluded sooner rather than later." Holmes regarded him with that penetrating stare which had disconcerted so many before him. "An accounting, Mr. Pemberton?" Those are curious words to use of a property restoration. A flicker of something, fear perhaps or guilt, crossed Pemberton's composed features. "There are curious things about this property, sir," he replied with obvious reluctance. "If you will accompany me, I shall show you what Carstairs has described, and perhaps something more besides." Pemberton produced a heavy iron key, its surface pitted with rust, save for the bright scratches where recent use had worn the metal clean. The great oak door protested with a prolonged groan as it swung inward, releasing a rush of stale air that carried the accumulated mustiness of 30 years' abandonment. The scent was complex and unpleasant, damp plaster, rotting wood, and beneath it all something metallic and sour that made me instinctively step back from the threshold. Holmes, however, moved forward without hesitation, his keen eyes already cataloguing the details of the entrance hall that lay beyond. Even shrouded in neglect, Raven's Hollow House retained traces of its former grandeur. Carved oak panelling rose to meet a coffered ceiling whose gilt had long since tarnished to the colour of old brass. Dust sheets draped the furniture like burial shrouds, and our footsteps echoed hollowly on the marble floor, stirring eddies of dust that danced in the pale shafts of light filtering through grimy windows. "You have not attempted any restoration work in the upper floors," Holmes observed, running a gloved finger along a banister and examining the accumulated grime. "Your efforts have been concentrated entirely below ground." "Precisely so," Carstairs confirmed, adjusting the heavy lanterns he carried. Pemberton's instructions were specific: make the foundations sound before attending to the more visible areas. The house has settled considerably during its years of abandonment, and certain structural concerns required immediate attention. And it was during this foundation work that you encountered your mysterious correspondent, Holmes remarked. Lead on, Mr. Carstairs, but first, Mr. Pemberton, I must press you once more regarding these family legends you mentioned. The time for evasion has passed. Pemberton's knuckles whitened as he gripped his hat brim. Very well, Mr. Holmes, though I warn you, what I have to relate reflects no credit upon my family name. Sir Bertram Ravenshollow was by all accounts a man of increasingly disturbed temperament in his final years. His servants whispered of violent rages of obsessive fears, a behaviour that grew more erratic with each passing month. We followed Carstairs through a narrow passage toward the rear of the house, where a door opened onto a steep stone stairway descending into darkness. The temperature dropped perceptibly as we began our descent, and the sound of our footsteps changed from the hollow echo of the marble hall to the duller thud of stone meeting stone. "What manner of fears?" Holmes inquired, as we made our way carefully down the worn steps. He became convinced that his younger brother James intended to murder him for the inheritance, Pemberton replied, his voice taking on a hollow quality in the confined stairwell. Whether there was any foundation for such suspicions, I cannot say. Captain James was, by all contemporary accounts, a gentleman of irreproachable character. But Sir Bertram's paranoia consumed him utterly. The undercroft into which we emerged was a testament to medieval craftsmanship. Massive stone pillars supported low, ribbed vaults, and the walls were constructed of blocks so large that it seemed impossible human hands could have set them in place. Holmes immediately began his examination of the chamber, moving with that peculiar combination of haste and precision that marked his investigative method. "Kentish ragstone," he murmured, running his palm over the rough surface of the nearest wall. "And note the mortar, Watson, lime-based, with a high proportion of sand. The construction predates the upper house by at least a century, possibly more. This was once a separate structure incorporated into the later building." Carstairs led us to the southern wall, where the mysterious knocking had occurred. Even in the lantern light, I could see the subtle bulge he had described, a slight but unmistakable distortion in the otherwise regular coursing of the ancient stones. Holmes approached this section with intense interest, producing his lens and examining the masonry with minute attention. "Most illuminating," said he after several minutes of silent study. "Watson, observe this section here, these 5 stones approximately 18 inches from the floor. Do you notice anything peculiar about their appearance?" I peered closely at the indicated area. "The mortar appears fresher than the surrounding courses," I ventured. "And the stones themselves, while clearly ancient, seem to have been more recently disturbed." "Excellent observation. The tooling marks are sharper, the edges less weathered by time. These stones have been removed and reset, though not, I think, in recent years. The work was done perhaps 30 years ago by someone with considerable skill in masonry." He turned to Pemberton. "You mentioned that Captain James Ravenshollow disappeared in 1859. That would be precisely 30 years past." A visible shudder ran through Pemberton's frame. "You suspect some connection between my cousin's paranoid fears and his brother's disappearance?" "I suspect nothing as yet," Holmes replied evenly. "I merely observe and deduce. Mr. Carstairs, if you would be so good as to repeat your experiment with the knocking, I should like to witness this phenomenon for myself." The builder stepped forward, his hammer trembling slightly in his grip. The earlier demonstration had clearly shaken him more than he cared to admit, and I could see the reluctance in every line of his body as he approached the wall. He raised the tool and struck 3 deliberate blows against the stone, sharp, clear sounds that rang through the vaulted chamber before dying into an oppressive silence. We waited, scarcely breathing, straining our ears against the quiet. The seconds stretched interminably, marked only by the distant murmur of the Thames and the faint drip of water somewhere in the darkness. I began to hope that the entire phenomenon had been some acoustic trick that would not repeat itself in our presence. Then, clear and unmistakable, 3 answering knocks came from within the solid wall. The sound was exactly as Carstairs had described, muffled but distinct, following the precise rhythm of his original signal. Pemberton uttered a strangled exclamation and stumbled backward, nearly dropping his lantern. Even my own nerves, seasoned by years of witnessing Holmes's investigations, felt the shock of that impossible response. Holmes alone remained perfectly composed, though I detected a gleam of fierce satisfaction in his grey eyes. "Remarkable," said he quietly. "We are indeed in communication with something that exists where our architectural assumptions insist nothing can be. The sound is too regular, too purposeful, to be any natural settling of the structure." He stepped closer to the wall, pressing his ear against the cold stone. "Mr. Pemberton, I must now ask you directly. When you inherited this property, did you receive any documents that might explain structural modifications made by Sir Bertram? Any correspondence, any architectural drawings, any records of construction work undertaken in the months before his death?" Pemberton's face had gone ashen in the flickering lantern light. For a long moment he seemed to struggle with some internal conflict. Then his shoulders sagged in defeat. There was something. A sealed packet left in the custody of the family solicitors, with instructions that it should only be opened under specific circumstances. What circumstances? "If sounds were ever reported from within the walls of this house," Pemberton whispered. "I opened the packet 2 days ago after Mr. Carstairs brought me his account. It contained things I had hoped never to see confirmed." Holmes's expression hardened. "Then you knew, when you summoned me here, that there might be some truth to this mystery. What did those documents contain, Mr. Pemberton?" "A confession," came the barely audible reply, "and architectural drawings showing modifications Sir Bertram made to this very chamber in the final months of his life. Modifications that included—" His voice broke entirely. "That included the construction of a concealed space within these walls." As if in response to his words, the knocking came again from behind the ancient stones, not the measured 3 blows of before, but a frantic, desperate hammering that seemed to speak of unimaginable torment and an equally unimaginable hope for release. The frantic hammering from within the wall ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence so profound that it seemed to press against our eardrums like a physical weight. In that oppressive quiet, I could hear the rapid breathing of our companions and the distant murmur of the Thames beyond the house's foundations. Holmes stood motionless before the wall, his hand still pressed against the cold stone, but I could see in his eyes that fierce concentration which preceded his most brilliant deductions. "Mr. Pemberton," said he at length, his voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere with surgical precision, "you will produce those documents immediately. The confession first, then the architectural drawings. Every detail may prove vital." Pemberton fumbled within his coat with trembling fingers and withdrew a leather portfolio, its edges worn smooth by age. From this he extracted several sheets of yellowed parchment, the topmost bearing a date in spidery, agitated handwriting, January the 20th, 1859. Holmes seized upon the papers eagerly, moving closer to Carstairs's lantern to examine them in the flickering light. "Listen carefully," Holmes commanded, and began to read aloud in that clear, penetrating voice which could make even the most mundane facts seem charged with significance. "I, Bertram Ravenshollow, do set down this account in the certain knowledge that what I have done places me beyond all hope of earthly forgiveness. The madness that has consumed me these 18 months past reached its culmination on the night of January 15th, when my brother James arrived at this house with protestations of brotherly concern that I knew to be false." The confession continued in increasingly disordered script, describing how Sir Bertram had become convinced of his brother's murderous intentions through what he termed various signs and portents. The document detailed with horrifying precision how he had drugged his brother's evening brandy, and while James lay insensible, conveyed him to a prepared chamber within the Undercroft walls. "The space I constructed," Holmes read, his voice growing quieter as the full horror of the account became clear, "measures 4 feet in height, 3 in width, and 18 inches in depth, sufficient to contain a man in crouched position, but offering no possibility of movement or escape. I told myself this was justice, that I was preventing the murder he surely planned. But as the days passed, and I heard his weakening cries from within the stone, I began to understand the true nature of my crime." Carstairs uttered a strangled exclamation and stepped backward, his face pale in the lantern light. Even my own medical training, which had inured me to many horrors, recoiled from the mental image of such calculated cruelty. The confession went on to describe how Sir Bertram had been driven to the edge of madness by the sounds of his brother's slow death, how the desperate knocking had continued for 5 days before ceasing entirely, and how the author had dismissed all servants who might have discovered his terrible secret. "But this is impossible," I protested when Holmes had finished reading. "If Captain James died 30 years ago, as this confession suggests, then what we have heard today defies all natural law. No human being could survive such confinement for 3 decades. Holmes carefully folded the documents and turned his attention to the architectural drawings that accompanied them. These were far more detailed than I had expected, precise cross-sections of the Undercroft wall showing not merely a hidden chamber, but an elaborate system of ventilation shafts, feeding mechanisms, and what appeared to be acoustic conduits running through the masonry. "Observe, Watson," said Holmes, tracing the intricate lines with his finger. "Sir Bertram was no mere madman acting in blind fury. These plans reveal a methodical intelligence, albeit one turned to horrific purpose. The chamber is shown here as part of a larger system. Note these narrow shafts leading upward through the chimney breast, and this complex arrangement of levers and chutes marked in the margin. This was not built merely for concealment, but for prolonged imprisonment." He moved back to the wall, his keen eyes scanning the stonework with renewed purpose. "According to these plans, the mechanism for accessing the chamber should be concealed within the masonry itself. We look for a stone that serves as both structural element and hidden lever, likely one of these larger blocks near the floor level." For several minutes, Holmes and Carstairs probed the suspicious section of wall, testing each stone for movement, while I kept watch on Pemberton, who seemed increasingly agitated. The shipping merchant had withdrawn to lean against a distant pillar, muttering to himself in a manner that suggested his nerves were stretched to their breaking point. "Here," Holmes announced suddenly, his hands pressed against a large coin stone. "This block shows signs of repeated handling. See how the mortar is worn smooth at the edges? The mechanism may still be functional after all these years." He applied steady pressure to the stone, and after a moment's resistance, it depressed with a sharp click. The sound echoed through the vaulted chamber, followed immediately by a grinding noise of stone against stone. Then, with ponderous majesty, a section of the wall, perhaps 3 feet wide, swung slowly inward on concealed hinges, revealing a narrow aperture beyond. A rush of stale, fetid air emerged from the opening, carrying with it an odour so foul that we all recoiled instinctively. It was the smell of long confinement, of stagnant air and organic decay, but beneath it lay something else, something that made my medical instincts prickle with unease. Holmes, holding his handkerchief to his face, was the first to approach the opening. He thrust his lantern into the gap, illuminating a stone-lined cell, exactly as the drawings had indicated. The space was impossibly narrow, barely wide enough for a man to stand, and perhaps 6 feet in length. The floor was thick with dust and debris, and in one corner lay what might once have been bedding, now rotted to mere fragments. But the chamber was not empty. In the far corner, hunched against the wall in a position that spoke of decades of cramped confinement, sat a figure that had once been human. The remains were desiccated rather than decomposed, preserved by the dry air and constant temperature of the stone cell. Tattered remnants of clothing still clung to the skeletal frame, and one bony hand was raised as if frozen in the act of knocking against the wall. "Captain James Ravenshollow, I presume?" Holmes said quietly, his voice betraying none of the horror that the rest of us felt. "But this presents us with an even greater mystery, gentlemen, for if this poor wretch has been dead these 30 years, as his condition clearly indicates, then who or what was responding to our knocking only minutes ago?" As if in answer to his question, the sound came again, not from the opened chamber, but from somewhere else within the wall, fainter now, but unmistakably the same measured knocking we had heard before. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he began examining the acoustic conduits shown in Sir Bertram's drawings with renewed intensity. "The game," he murmured, "is more complex than we initially supposed. Watson, I believe we are dealing not with the supernatural, but with something far more dangerous, a living opponent who has been using this chamber's tragic history for purposes we have yet to divine." At that moment, a sound echoed from the stairs above us, the heavy tread of boots on stone, moving with purpose toward the undercroft. Someone was descending toward us, and from the deliberate nature of their approach, I suspected our investigation was about to take a decidedly perilous turn. "Gentlemen," Holmes said, his hand moving to his coat pocket where I knew he kept his own revolver, "I believe we are about to meet the true author of this mystery. I fear the encounter may prove considerably more hazardous than a conversation with the dead." The footsteps grew more distinct as they descended, accompanied by the soft rustle of fabric and what sounded like the careful placement of each foot upon the worn stone. Holmes motioned for silence, his hand moving instinctively toward his coat pocket where his revolver rested. The measured quality of the approach suggested someone familiar with these treacherous steps, someone who had navigated them many times before. A figure emerged from the shadowed stairwell, carrying a shuttered lantern that cast only a narrow beam of yellow light across the flagstones. To my astonishment, the newcomer was a woman of perhaps 60 years, dressed in the severe black of mourning, her grey hair pulled back in a manner that spoke of rigid self-discipline. Despite her age, she moved with surprising steadiness, and there was something in her bearing that commanded immediate attention. She paused at the bottom of the steps, her gaze taking in our assembled group, before settling upon the open chamber and its ghastly contents. When she spoke, her voice carried the cultured tones of education, though roughened by what seemed like years of suppressed emotion. "So you have found him at last?" she said, setting down her lantern with practiced care. I confess I had begun to wonder if this day would ever come. 30 years is a very long time to wait for justice. Holmes stepped forward, his detective instincts overriding any surprise at this unexpected revelation. "You have the advantage of us, madam. Might I inquire as to your identity and your particular interest in this chamber?" The woman's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth, only a profound weariness. "I am Mrs. Sarah Blackwood, Mr. Holmes, for I recognize you from your descriptions in the press, but I was born Sarah Ravenshollow, sister to both the monster who built that tomb and the good man who perished within it." The revelation struck me with almost physical force. Here was a living connection to the tragedy we had uncovered, someone who had known both brothers in life and had witnessed the terrible events that led to Captain James's imprisonment. "You knew of your brother's crime?" Holmes asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Not until it was too late to prevent it," Mrs. Blackwood replied, her composure cracking slightly. "I was serving as housekeeper in this very house during those final months, though Bertram did not know my true identity. I had taken my husband's name after an unfortunate marriage and returned to the household where I was born. I watched Bertram descend into madness, saw the paranoid delusions consume him, but I never imagined he would commit such an act of calculated cruelty." She moved closer to the open chamber, gazing upon the skeletal remains with an expression of infinite sorrow. "I heard sounds from within these walls in those first days, the same sounds that brought you here, Mr. Holmes. But when I pressed Bertram for explanation, he forbade me from investigating further. By the time I discovered the truth, by the time I found his drawings hidden in the study, 5 days had passed. James was beyond all earthly help. Holmes had been listening with that intense concentration which marked his most significant cases. Then it was you who created the knocking sounds that so alarmed Mr. Carstairs. You who have been using the acoustic conduits your brother designed. The house has stood empty for 30 years, Mr. Holmes, but it has not been unguarded. I have kept watch, ensuring that no casual renovation would disturb James's resting place before the truth could be properly revealed. When Mr. Pemberton inherited the property and began his restoration work, I knew the time had come. She opened a worn leather portfolio and withdrew several sheets of yellowed paper. I studied Bertram's drawings carefully, learned to use the system he had created. Sound travels in remarkable ways through stone, and what Mr. Carstairs heard as knocking from within solid masonry was actually my signal from concealed spaces in the upper floors. Carstairs found his voice, though it trembled with shock. "You have been living in this house all these years?" "The upper floors contain many rooms, Mr. Carstairs, and a woman who knows every secret passage and hidden panel can move about quite unseen. I have been the guardian of this terrible secret, waiting for someone with the skill and reputation to ensure that justice would finally be served." Holmes's eyes narrowed with sudden understanding. "But there is more to this than family loyalty, is there not, Mrs. Blackwood? You mentioned that Mr. Pemberton inherited this property. What you have not mentioned is what he stands to lose should your brother's crime be definitively proven." A flush of anger crossed Pemberton's pale features. "I don't know what you're implying, Holmes." Mrs. Blackwood regarded him with cold disdain. "Tell them about the inheritance clause, Aldous. Tell them what the family solicitors made clear when you received the deed to this property." When Pemberton remained silent, she continued with relentless precision. "Bertram's will contained a provision that if his crime against James were ever discovered and proven beyond doubt, the entire estate, not merely this house but all the family properties and investments, would pass to James's legitimate heirs rather than to Bertram's collateral line. Mr. Pemberton stands to lose a considerable fortune. Do you not, Aldous?" The shipping merchant slumped against the nearest pillar, his resistance finally crumbling. "It's true," he whispered. "The solicitors were quite explicit. If James's murder could be definitively established, everything would pass to his daughter's children in America. I would be left with nothing." Holmes's expression hardened with contempt. "And so you hope to complete the renovations quickly and quietly, sealing away the evidence forever before anyone could discover the truth. When Carstairs reported the mysterious sounds, you realized your plan was endangered, but you also saw an opportunity. By bringing me into the investigation, you hoped I would dismiss the phenomenon as some natural occurrence, providing you with authoritative confirmation that nothing untoward existed within these walls." The sound of multiple footsteps on the stairs interrupted this revelation. Holmes moved swiftly to the stairway entrance, then relaxed visibly as Inspector Lestrade's familiar figure emerged from the gloom, followed by two constables. "Mr. Holmes?" said the inspector, surveying the extraordinary scene with evident bewilderment. "We received an anonymous message that a murder had been discovered at this address. I see we're not too late, though by the look of things we're about 30 years too late." Holmes permitted himself a thin smile. "On the contrary, Lestrade, your timing is impeccable. We have a confession, a body, and several witnesses to what may prove one of the most unusual cases in your records. Mrs. Blackwood here has provided us with the key to a mystery that has waited 3 decades for resolution." As Lestrade began organizing his men and taking preliminary statements from our strange assembly, I found myself standing beside Mrs. Blackwood, who continued to gaze at her brother's remains with an expression of profound sadness mixed with grim satisfaction. 30 years of waiting," I murmured. "Was it worth the vigil?" She turned to me, and in her eyes I saw not triumph, but only the deep weariness of a burden finally set down. "Justice delayed is not justice denied, Dr. Watson. James deserved better than to be remembered as a man who simply vanished. Now at least the truth is known and he can rest in peace." Holmes approached us, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Blackwood, your dedication to your brother's memory is admirable, but I must point out that there are still aspects of this case that require explanation. The frantic knocking we heard earlier, the desperate hammering that occurred while we were all present in this room. If you were not in position to use the acoustic system at that moment, then who or what produced those sounds?" A shadow crossed Mrs. Blackwood's composed features. "I heard it too, Mr. Holmes, and I confess it puzzled me greatly. In all my years of watching over this house, I have never encountered sounds that I could not explain through natural causes or my own activities." Holmes turned back toward the opened chamber, his keen eyes studying the ancient masonry with renewed intensity. "And perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, our investigation is not yet complete. The dead have told us their tale, but I begin to suspect that Raven's Hollow House guards more secrets than we have yet discovered." As Lestrade continued his methodical work and the grey morning light filtered down through the grimy windows above, I could not shake the feeling that we stood at the threshold of revelations yet to come. The mystery of Captain James's murder had been solved, but something in Holmes's manner suggested that the true complexity of this case was only beginning to unfold. Holmes withdrew from our group and began a methodical examination of the acoustic conduits shown in Sir Bertram's drawings, his keen mind working through the implications of what we had discovered. He moved with that peculiar intensity which indicated his thoughts were racing ahead of the visible evidence, connecting disparate elements into a coherent whole. "Lestrade," said he suddenly, his voice cutting through the bustle of the constable's activities, I must ask you to delay the removal of these remains. There are several aspects of this case that demand immediate attention, and I fear we may be dealing with more than historical tragedy." The inspector looked up from his notebook with evident irritation. "Surely the matter is concluded, Mr. Holmes. We have the confession, the body, and witnesses to corroborate the circumstances. What further complications could there be?" Holmes pressed his ear against the stone wall, tapping with his knuckles at various points along the masonry. "Consider the acoustic properties of this chamber, Lestrade. These walls are 4 feet thick, backed by solid earth. No human voice, however desperate, could penetrate such mass with sufficient volume to be heard elsewhere in the house. Yet Sir Bertram's confession clearly states that he heard his brother's weakening cries over the course of 5 days. The implication struck me with sudden clarity. Then Bertram must have heard those sounds through the acoustic system he constructed, which means the conduits were designed to carry sound not merely into the chamber, but out of it as well. Precisely, Watson. And if we follow the path of these conduits— He traced the intricate lines on the architectural drawings with his finger, moving from the undercroft upward through the chimney breast. "They terminate in the south wing, in the partition wall that Carstairs identified as hollow. But there is another consideration that troubles me greatly." Holmes crouched beside the skeletal remains, producing his lens to examine the floor of the narrow cell with minute attention. After several moments of silent study, he straightened with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Mrs. Blackwood, you have kept faithful watch over this house for 30 years, yet I observe that someone else has been here quite recently." He used his penknife to lift a small, dark object from a crevice near the rear wall. A burnt match of a type commonly sold in the riverside taverns. The wood still bears the scent of sulphur, indicating it was struck within the last day or two. The elderly woman stepped forward, her composure faltering for the first time since her arrival. "That is impossible, Mr. Holmes. I would have known of any intrusion. The house has remained sealed, and I alone possess the keys. The house above may have remained sealed, madam, but we stand beside the Thames, in a structure built by a man obsessed with concealment and secret passages." Holmes directed his lantern toward the rear of the cell, illuminating what I had initially mistaken for mere shadow. "Observe the base of the wall here, a low, arched opening heavily grated with iron bars. This is a drainage outlet designed to prevent the cell from flooding during high tide." He pressed his face close to the rusted grate, and we all fell silent, straining to hear over the distant murmur of the river. Then, faint but unmistakable, came a sound that chilled my blood, a wet, gasping cough, followed by the scrape of metal against stone. "Help!" a voice croaked from the depths below, barely audible through the heavy masonry. "The water! It's rising!" Holmes spun around, his face galvanized with urgent purpose. "Carstairs, your sledgehammer, immediately! There is a man trapped in the drainage system beneath this floor, and if I am not mistaken, the tide is turning. We have perhaps 20 minutes before that conduit fills completely." Pemberton, who had been standing in stunned silence, suddenly let out a low moan and staggered backward against the nearest pillar. Holmes crossed the distance between them in 2 swift strides, seizing the shipping merchant by the lapels of his coat. "You knew," Holmes said, his voice low and dangerous. "You knew the cell was not the only secret of this accursed place. Who is down there, Pemberton? Speak now, or his death will be on your conscience as surely as your cousin's crime." The man's composure crumbled entirely under Holmes's penetrating stare. "I didn't think he would become trapped," he stammered, his words tumbling over each other in desperate haste. "I sent him down last night. A mudlark from the Wapping docks, a man who knows the old sewer systems. He was to enter through the river outlet, break into the cell from below, and remove the evidence. I wanted it gone before your investigation could proceed. You sent a man into a tidal drainage system with the river at flood stage. Holmes released him with a gesture of profound disgust. Your greed has condemned an innocent man to drowning in the very tomb where your cousin murdered his brother. Lestrade stepped forward, his face grim with professional duty. Aldous Pemberton, I arrest you for conspiracy to destroy evidence and for endangering human life. Constable Thatcher, see that he is secured. He turned to Holmes with renewed respect. What do you need from us?
Sir? Every available man and all of Carstairs' tools, Holmes replied, already moving toward the cell. Watson, I shall need your medical bag. If we manage to extract this poor fellow, he will likely be half drowned and suffering from exposure. The peaceful atmosphere of our investigation vanished instantly, replaced by a frantic race against the inexorable Thames tide. Carstairs, grasping the urgency of the situation, selected his heaviest sledgehammer and stepped into the narrow confines of the cell, his weathered face set with grim determination. The grate is set into a keystone arch, Holmes directed, holding his lantern steady despite the flying chips of stone and mortar. Strike at the surrounding blocks. If we can break the supporting masonry, we can lever the entire assembly inward. The clang of steel against stone rang through the vaulted undercroft, each blow measured and precise despite the desperate urgency that drove us. With every passing minute, I found myself checking my pocket watch, knowing that somewhere below our feet, a man was fighting for his life against the rising waters of London's great river. The mortar is ancient and crumbling, Carstairs reported between blows, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill air. But the ironwork is solid. This may take longer than we hoped. Holmes seized a second hammer from the builder's kit and joined him in the confined space, the two men working in alternating rhythm to maximize their effectiveness. The sound of their efforts echoed through the chamber like some desperate percussion, punctuated by the increasingly urgent calls for help from the trapped man below. "He's weakening," I observed, pressing my ear to the floor near the grate. "His voice is growing fainter, and there are longer intervals between his calls." "Then we must work faster," Holmes replied grimly, putting his full strength behind each blow. "Lestrade, have your men prepare ropes and lanterns. When we break through, someone will need to descend into that drainage tunnel immediately." The race against time had begun in earnest, and I could only pray that our combined efforts would prove sufficient to save a life that hung in the balance between human determination and the relentless forces of nature. The mystery of Raven's Hollow House had claimed one victim 30 years ago. We were resolved that it would not claim another on this grey November morning. The ancient mortar crumbled under the relentless assault of steel against stone, each blow from Holmes and Carstairs sending clouds of chalky dust through the confined space of the cell. The sound of their hammers rang through the vaulted undercroft like artillery fire, punctuated by the increasingly desperate gasps of the trapped man below. I knelt beside the opening, playing my lantern beam down through the rusted bars, watching with growing alarm as the dark water rose steadily around the pale, terror-stricken face that stared upward from the depths. "The keystone is shifting," Carstairs announced, pointing to a hairline crack that had appeared in the mortar surrounding the grate. "One more concentrated effort on the left side, and we should be able to lever the entire assembly free." Holmes nodded grimly, repositioning his sledgehammer for maximum effect. "Watson, have the rope ready. The moment we break through, someone must descend immediately. The tide waits for no man, and our friend below has perhaps minutes before that tunnel fills completely." With a final,
coordinated blow from both men, the weakened arch gave way with a crack like a pistol shot. The heavy iron grate, along with several surrounding stones, collapsed inward and plunged into the churning water below. A rush of foul air emerged from the opening, carrying the stench of Thames mud and decades of accumulated filth. Holmes was at the edge of the opening instantly, securing the rope around his waist with practiced efficiency. "The space is narrow but navigable," he reported, thrusting his lantern into the gap. "I can see him wedged in a junction, perhaps 15 feet down. The water is already past his chest." Before any of us could protest the danger, Holmes had lowered himself through the jagged aperture, his lean frame disappearing into the dark tunnel below. I grasped the rope, feeling each movement as he descended through the treacherous passage, fighting against the current that threatened to sweep both men toward the river. "He's reached the junction," Lestrade observed, reading the rope's movements with professional expertise. "Now comes the difficult part." For several agonizing minutes, we heard only the sound of rushing water and Holmes's muffled voice echoing from the depths. Then came his urgent shout, "Haul away, I have him, but he's unconscious." Lestrade, his constables, Carstairs, and I seized the rope in a coordinated line. The weight was tremendous, 2 grown men fighting against the drag of the current, but with steady, measured pulls, we drew them upward. Holmes emerged first, gasping for air, his face streaked with slime and river mud, his arm wrapped protectively around the limp form of a slight, wiry man whose ragged clothing marked him as one of the Thames mudlarks. We dragged both men onto the flagstones, where I immediately began my medical assessment. The victim was in severe distress, lips blue with cold, breathing shallow and irregular, pulse thready but present. I loosened his sodden clothing and began artificial respiration, working rhythmically to clear his waterlogged lungs. "Broken ribs on the left side," I reported, my fingers probing his torso. "Severe hypothermia and partial drowning. But he'll survive. It was a near thing, though." The man's eyes fluttered open after several minutes, staring up at us with bewildered terror. "The water!" he rasped, coughing violently. "It came so fast! The gentleman said it would be safe at low tide." Holmes, despite his own bedraggled condition, leaned forward with sharp interest. "What gentleman? Who sent you down there?" The mudlark's gaze shifted to Pemberton, who stood pale and trembling under the watchful eye of Lestrade's constable. "That one there." Mr. Pemberton gave me 5 sovereigns and promised 5 more when the job was done, said I was to find bones in a hidden room and smash them to bits, scatter the pieces in the river, said they was cursed. "Indeed they were cursed," Holmes said grimly, rising to his feet and fixing Pemberton with a stare of withering contempt. "Cursed by the greed of a man who would risk an innocent life to conceal historical evidence of murder." Lestrade stepped forward, his notebook snapping shut with finality. "Aldous Pemberton, you are under arrest for conspiracy to destroy evidence, endangering human life, and accessory to attempted murder. The charges will likely increase once we complete our investigation." As the constables led the defeated Pemberton away, Mrs. Blackwood approached with blankets she had retrieved from her supplies in the upper house. Her composure remained steady despite the horror of what we had witnessed. "I never knew there was another entrance," she said quietly, helping me wrap the shivering mudlark. "In all my years of watching, I never suspected the drainage system extended so far." Holmes examined several small objects he had retrieved from the tunnel, fabric fragments and what appeared to be a tarnished button. These artifacts suggest our mudlark friend was not the first to explore these passages recently. Someone else has been using this route to access the house, someone with considerably different intentions than mere evidence destruction. He turned to Mrs. Blackwood, his expression thoughtful. "During your long vigil, did you ever observe unusual activity near the river wall? Boats that lingered, perhaps, or signs that someone else knew of these hidden ways?" She frowned in concentration. There were occasionally small craft that seemed to loiter near the foundation at low tide. I assumed they were scavengers searching for scrap metal in the mud. But now that you mention it, they appeared with curious regularity, always when the house seemed most deserted. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the light of renewed investigation. "Then our work here is far from finished. We have solved the mystery of Captain James's murder and thwarted Pemberton's sordid attempt at concealment, but I begin to suspect that Ravenshollow House has been serving purposes we have yet to discover. Mrs. Blackwood, I believe it is time you showed us that hollow partition wall in the south wing. Something tells me we shall find it far more interesting than mere architectural curiosity." The ascent from the undercroft felt like emerging from a tomb, each step carrying us further from the grim revelation of Captain James's fate toward whatever secrets the upper floors might yield. Mrs. Fine Blackwood led our reduced party through the dust-shrouded corridors, her lantern casting wavering shadows against the neglected panelling. Holmes walked beside her, his clothes still damp from his rescue of the mudlark, but his mind clearly racing ahead to connect the drainage system's recent use with the mysterious boat activity she had observed. The south wing presented a marked contrast to the Tudor core of the house. Here, Georgian elegance had once reigned, with tall sash windows overlooking the Thames and delicate plasterwork that spoke of 18th-century refinement. Yet beneath the accumulated grime of decades, I detected subtle signs that this area had not remained entirely undisturbed during the house's supposed abandonment. "Here is the partition wall that first aroused my suspicions," Carstairs announced, stopping before an unremarkable stretch of panelling between two doorways. "According to the architectural drawings, this should be solid masonry backing the main chimney breast, yet when struck, it produces a distinctly hollow sound." Holmes approached the wall with characteristic precision, tapping methodically along its surface while pressing his ear close to detect variations in resonance. After several minutes of careful examination, he straightened with an expression of keen interest. "The hollow space extends from floor to ceiling," he announced, "but observe these subtle scratches in the woodwork near the upper moulding, and the way the dust lies thinner along this vertical seam. Someone has been operating a concealed mechanism here, and recently." Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward, a thoughtful expression crossing her weathered features. "My brother Bertram was obsessed with hidden passages and secret chambers. This section of the house was his particular domain during those final months. The mechanism, if memory serves, is concealed within the decorative carving of the fireplace surround." Following her guidance, Holmes pressed firmly against an ornate rosette carved into the marble mantelpiece. With a soft click of releasing springs, a section of the panelling slid silently aside on well-oiled runners, revealing a narrow passage beyond. Unlike the grim stone cell below, this space showed clear evidence of recent habitation and careful maintenance. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, stepping into the hidden chamber with his lantern held high. The passage was perhaps 4 feet wide and extended some 20 feet parallel to the main corridor. Along one wall, shelves had been installed bearing an eclectic mixture of items that made my medical training prickle with recognition. Surgical instruments, bottles of antiseptic solution, rolls of clean bandages, and several leather cases containing what appeared to be pharmaceutical supplies. "Someone has been using this space as a makeshift surgery," I observed, examining a particularly well-equipped medical kit. These instruments are of excellent quality and recent manufacture. The morphine solution is fresh, and these bandages show no signs of deterioration. Holmes had moved to a small writing desk positioned at the far end of the passage, where a collection of papers lay neatly arranged. His eyes scanned the documents with rapid intensity, and I could see his expression growing increasingly thoughtful as he absorbed their contents. "Letters addressed to a Dr. Margaret Ashford," he announced, holding up several sheets of correspondence. "Formerly of Guy's Hospital, according to these professional references, but struck from the medical register 18 months ago for treating patients whom the established medical community deemed unworthy of attention. These more recent letters describe her continued work among the Thames mudlarks and dock workers, providing medical care to those who would otherwise receive none." Mrs. Blackwood sank onto a small stool, her composure finally showing signs of strain. "Then all these years, while I maintained my vigil above, someone was moving freely through the passages below. And the sounds I occasionally heard, which I attributed to settling timbers or vermin, were actually this doctor going about her charitable work." "Precisely," Holmes confirmed, examining a detailed map of the Thames drainage system that had been pinned to one wall. "Dr. Ashford has been using Sir Bertram's acoustic conduits as ventilation shafts and his hidden passages as a clandestine medical facility. She enters through the tidal drainage system at low water, treats her patients in safety and secrecy, then departs before the flood returns." The implications of this discovery were staggering. We had uncovered not merely the solution to an ancient murder, but evidence of ongoing humanitarian work conducted in the very chambers where that murder had been concealed. Yet something in Holmes's manner suggested that our investigation was far from complete. "There is more here than medical charity," he said quietly, producing a ledger whose pages contained entries in a coded script. These appear to be records of some sort, dates, times, and what look like shipping references. Dr. Ashford may have been treating more than injured mudlarks in these hidden rooms. As if summoned by the intensity of our discussion, the sound of footsteps echoed from the concealed passage behind us. We turned as one to see a figure emerge from the shadows, a woman of middle years, her dark hair streaked with silver, her practical clothing bearing the unmistakable marks of recent medical work. She carried a leather surgical bag and regarded us with a mixture of resignation and quiet dignity. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said, in a voice that carried the authority of long medical practice. "I had hoped to complete my work here without discovery, but I see that circumstances have conspired against discretion. I am Dr. Margaret Ashford, and before you judge my actions, I would ask that you hear the full account of why I have made this accursed house my sanctuary." Holmes regarded Dr. Ashford with that penetrating yet respectful gaze he reserved for those whose actions, however irregular, were motivated by principle rather than profit. "Please, doctor, be seated. Your equipment suggests medical work of considerable sophistication, and your presence here indicates a story worth hearing in full." Dr. Ashford set down her surgical bag with practiced care, her composure intact despite the gravity of discovery. 18 months ago, I was dismissed from Guy's Hospital for providing proper medical care to dock workers and mudlarks who could not pay the required fees. The board deemed such charity detrimental to the hospital's reputation and financial stability. My patients, however, did not cease to need treatment merely because I had lost my position. She gestured toward the well-stocked shelves around us. A former colleague, more sympathetic than courageous, provided me with Sir Bertram's architectural drawings as a curiosity. When I realized this house offered perfect concealment with river access, I began conducting my practice here. The mudlarks knew of the drainage entrance, and word spread among those who needed help but could find none elsewhere. Holmes examined the coded ledger with renewed interest. Yet these entries suggest activities beyond medical charity. Shipping schedules, cargo manifests, personnel movements. You have been gathering intelligence. A shadow crossed Dr. Ashford's features. My patients see everything that moves along the Thames, Mr. Holmes. In treating their injuries, I began to notice patterns, systematic brutalities that spoke of organized cruelty rather than random violence. Women and children bearing marks of deliberate torture, sailors with wounds that suggested punishment for resistance. When I pressed for details, one name recurred with disturbing frequency: vessels operating under Pemberton's shipping concern. Human trafficking, I breathed, the full horror becoming clear. Precisely, Dr. Watson. I began recording what I observed, coding the entries to protect my patients while documenting evidence of systematic abuse. I had hoped to gather sufficient proof to force official action, but I knew that as a struck-off physician, my testimony would carry little weight. Holmes closed the ledger with decisive authority. Your evidence may prove invaluable, Doctor. Mr. Pemberton has already been arrested on other charges, but these records could expose a far larger criminal enterprise. Mrs. Blackwood leaned forward, her expression troubled. But the knocking sounds we heard earlier, the desperate hammering from within the walls. If you were not operating the acoustic system at that moment, what produced those sounds? Dr. Ashford's composure faltered slightly. That phenomenon has puzzled me greatly. 3 nights ago, while treating a patient below, I heard identical sounds coming from areas where no human could possibly exist. It frightened me sufficiently that I have avoided the deeper chambers since. Holmes's eyes sharpened with sudden comprehension. Then we have multiple mysteries converging in this accursed house. The historical murder of Captain James, Mrs. Blackwood's faithful vigil, your humanitarian work, Pemberton's conspiracy, and still these unexplained manifestations that none can account for. As if summoned by his words, a low mechanical thrumming reached us from the direction of the river. The sound of a steam launch approaching through the fog. Holmes moved swiftly to the shuttered window, peering through the slats with grim intensity. 6 men, heavily armed, approaching the private wharf, he reported tersely. Dr. Ashford, I suspect your intelligence gathering has attracted unwelcome attention. These are not casual visitors. The doctor's face went pale. The trafficking operation, if they suspect I have evidence, then we must ensure that evidence survives to reach the proper authorities, Holmes declared, his voice carrying that steely determination I knew so well. Watson, check your revolver. Ladies, you must remain concealed while we determine their intentions. Mrs. Blackwood, we may have need of your knowledge of this house's secret ways. The sound of heavy boots on the garden path announced that our mysterious visitors had reached the grounds. Whatever forces Dr. Ashford's investigations had disturbed, they had now come to Raven's Hollow House, seeking resolution, and we stood between them and their objective. The game, Holmes murmured. His hand, moving to his coat pocket, enters its final phase. The heavy footfalls echoed through the entrance hall as Holmes moved with characteristic precision, directing our small party into defensive positions. Through the acoustic conduits, he called down to Lestrade in the Undercroft, his voice carrying clearly through Sir Bertram's ingenious speaking system. Within moments, we heard the reassuring sound of constables ascending the servants' stairs, moving to surround the wing. The confrontation was swift and decisive, the traffickers, expecting to find a lone physician with incriminating records, instead encountered the full force of Scotland Yard. Their leader, a scarred brute with the weathered look of the Thames waterfront, surrendered his weapon when faced with Lestrade's truncheon and the business end of my service revolver. The others followed suit, their mission of intimidation transformed into ignominious capture. Yet it was Holmes's final revelation that provided the most satisfying resolution to our extraordinary case. Leading us past Captain James's cell to a section of drainage tunnel we had not previously explored, he forced open a concealed iron hatch that revealed a larger chamber beneath. There, huddled in the darkness, were a dozen terrified souls, men, women, and children, whom Pemberton's organization had intended to ship abroad as human cargo. "The knocking you heard 3 nights ago, Dr. Ashford," Holmes announced as we helped the victims to safety, "was neither supernatural nor mechanical. It was the desperate signal of the living, trapped in the very depths where Sir Bertram once imprisoned his brother." The house's tragic history had come full circle. The chambers built for murder now served to conceal modern slavery. The resolution brought swift justice. Pemberton faced charges that would ensure his permanent imprisonment, while Dr. Ashford's ledger provided evidence to dismantle the entire trafficking network. The medical authorities, faced with undeniable proof of her heroism, moved quickly to restore her license. Mrs. Blackwood finally laid her vigil to rest, knowing that justice had been served not merely for the past, but for the present as well. Back in our Baker Street sitting room, Holmes settled into his armchair with evident satisfaction. The fog had lifted from London, revealing a clear November night that seemed to promise better days ahead. "It is remarkable, Watson," he observed, lighting his pipe with a steady hand, "how the echoes of past crimes can illuminate present injustices. Sir Bertram built his acoustic system to torment a dying man, yet those same conduits ultimately gave voice to victims who might otherwise have vanished without trace." I poured 2 glasses of brandy, reflecting on the extraordinary convergence of past and present we had witnessed. The knocking that began our investigation was indeed the call of the dead seeking justice, but also the cry of the living demanding rescue. Holmes nodded, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight. "Precisely. In solving one murder, we prevented countless others. The walls of Raven's Hollow House held many secrets, Watson, but in the end they could not silence the voice of justice itself." The case was closed, but its echoes would resonate long after the Thames fog had cleared from that accursed house beside the river.